Hey everyone, this is Will Costello, Master Sommelier, joining you today for SOMMSCHOOL with my very good friend Josh Orr, also Master Sommelier, and the should I call you the regional manager for broadband selections in California? Is it the Southwest? Is it the whole West Coast? How
Southern
like to be
California,
addressed?
because Southern California is like 4 states on the East Coast, if not more, and then all of Nevada.
Got it. So you come out to Nevada too, which is great. I think you did a late night event over at Lamai, didn't you guys, a couple of weeks back? Good.
Oh man, and by late night you mean all night. I think I got home in true Vegas fashion as the sun was rising, but thankfully there were no kids and no commitments, so I was able to sleep and get some rest the next day. But whew, that was no joke.
Well, that was probably and honestly before the whole world shut down, like right around that time, huh?
Yeah, it was might have been, I want to say like end of January, start of February. So
Yeah.
it was like a week or two before maybe, but yeah, it was close. You were hearing hubbubs and whatnot, but we snuck that one in before everything went south. The last thing I think before the whole shutdown was you and me working down here in San Diego for the CMS exam. That was right before.
Yeah, it was days before.
Yeah,
So
quite literally. I had travel plans set up to go and do some other CMS stuff in Texas that the end of that week, and I was supposed to leave on a flight on Friday morning, and I was allowed on Thursday night, given the choice by the guy who was heading up the exam, and I opted not to go, and then everything shut down on Friday and Saturday, and I'm glad I wasn't stuck on a flight as
yeah,
things
right.
shut down. It would have been a funny attempt to get back from Texas.
Well, this is a series I've been doing, hosted by the Miller family of Bien Nacido in Solomon Hills, in the whole goal to reach out to other sommeliers and trade professionals about how we can all become better sommeliers. And today's topic was primarily based upon the fact that I'm sure you knew when you were a sommelier. I'm sure you now know that you're on the other side selling wine to both distributors and trade and consumers, that Rhone Varietals are everyone's favorite and least favorite wines at the same time. It's like, I remember, so I kind of started drinking wine and getting into wine in about 2004. I was a busboy at a restaurant in San Diego. It's called Blue Fire Grill. I was kind of joining all of the captains, or I guess they were just servers, while they were getting together on Friday nights after work, and we'd all bring some bottles, and I was learning about wine. My favorite thing, absolutely, to drink back then was Australian Shiraz. And you know why? It was two reasons. It was super fruity and super cheap, right? And Malbec has essentially taken over that position as like the BTG or by the glass wine that everybody wants to have, that fulfills that big, rich, fruity, and conscious price point. But it seems that Rhone varietals are the ones that when you put it in someone's mouth, they love. They want to drink. They're like, wow, I should drink more of this stuff. But the sales never come through, and Cabernet or Malbec or Zinfandel continue to take over as the dominant varietals. It's a small portion on most people's wine lists, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. This is more of like a free flow conversation. As topics come up, I'll maybe ask you some questions, but I want to get your overall approach, since you were obviously a sommelier and now you are selling wonderful examples from all over the world of Syrah, and I mean especially South Africa. What is your take on Rhone and why people love and don't love them at the same time?
Well, I agree with you. One of the things when I was on the floor here in San Diego, at least, I had a joke on my wine list at the Marriott, that because I would have the wine list set up where on one side it was the wines that you could look at and from the cellar, and then on the other side was some sort of information or some sort of tidbit, anecdote, and the one for the Rhone page, sorry, I got distracted a bit, was about Syrah, and it was this conversation, a little bit of a essentially like, hey, saw me approaching a table, what are your favorite wines, what is something you want to drink tonight, and the guest responding with, I want something with dark fruit, I want something with a little bit of spice to it, full bodied, and but not Cabernet. Great, let me bring you some Syrah. No, I hate Syrah. And that's always the response. And it's funny because I don't know if Rhone Varietals, I don't know if they get lost in the red blend camp of like, oh, I drink red blends. That's all I do. And get lost in that mix or what. But for whatever reason, red blends are successful. But I think that's such a broad category. That's like saying red wine is successful.
Correct.
You and I both know how big that camp is. But I think finding, at least for me, when I was on the floor, it was always, and this has actually worked in the sales world as well, engaging with whoever you're talking to and trying to find those, well, I guess like using a rock climbing metaphor, handholds that people can grasp onto to give them some comfort in understanding it. Parallels, laterals, things that they may have tasted. If you ask them what have they drank, and all of a sudden they say, well, I had, Linny Colado, and it's like, oh, well, all right, that's a Rhone blend. It's a little more high octane because it's from Paso, but we're in the right camp. We can start down those paths and discussing, because it's a little, you can very quickly fall into kind of like the Portuguese wine dilemma, where it's like, oh, what's in this wine? Voisinho, Rabigato, Gouveio, and just it just sounds like peanuts. Wah, 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 wah. And so until the mass drinking public gets comfortable with things like Mourvedre, Grenache, or even like the term GSM, and to a lesser extent like the white Rhone blends, MArsanne and Roussanne, things like that, you're going to have to find those bridges, and you have to work for it. And I found that probing a little bit with finding out what they drink and seeing if there's anything you can latch onto that they have familiarity with has helped, both in a sommelier, or both on the sales side on the restaurant floor, and then as well a little bit, at least with sommeliers and with working in the sales side, there is more of a familiarity with it, but there's a reticence when you start talking about like, oh, I love this, but I'm not sure how I'd sell it.
So when you're saying familiarity, are you talking about fruit, ripeness? Are you talking about flavor profiles, i.e. black fruit, like you mentioned? Are you talking about, not necessarily getting into the conversation about acid structure, but are you talking about texture, a bigger, richer wine? What are those familiarities?
So I think that's where the questioning comes in and figuring out, because another parallel that kind of give an idea, I guess, is we talked about this at the course, is what is sweetness to you? What is sweetness to me? What is sweetness to everybody else? It varies. So in the context of Rhone varieties, you got to find out if that person's giving you that idea based on texture, fruit profile, or if they've heard somebody say a GSM or say a Rhone blend. Where are they in their head? Because in your head, it may make total sense, but to them, they may just be doing the, okay. Yeah. And they really actually have no idea. And so,
the best I had was, and it doesn't have to do with Rhone Varietals, it was just a guest at the table when I asked her, and it was very, very straightforward. Do you like ripe strawberry jam, or do you like tart, tangy cranberries? And I thought that was the most basic conversation. Like, I wanted to sell her some Pinot, but I didn't know where in the world. And she went, I don't know. I'm like, oh no, like, where do you start?
You're forcing me to make a decision. Oh no, all I want is for you to make the decision for me and then me to critique it.
Right.
And that's a little bit of the hard part. That's where, like, like you hear and hear stories about like Paul Greco in New York, and he does an amazing job of telling stories about how he takes that nervous situation right there and kind of embraces it. And he'll just walk over to the table and be like, so what do you guys like? And they give him a couple ideas. He's like, what are you thinking spending wise? And they give him an idea, and he just leaves.
Yes.
And comes back with wine. And that's kind of the cavalier approach that, every sommelier dreams of. And granted, he owns his spots, and he also has the legend that is himself that allows you to do that. So I always kept that in mind. But I feel a little bit of it is, especially with your example, it's them wanting you to make a decision for them and then being able to critique it rather than actually be able to talk about their own. Yeah, exactly. And that's a tough one. Because what you used there was a great example as far as talking about flavor profile. And I think Rhone varieties, certainly from the red standpoint, present that. Because when you're talking about Syrah, you have a lot of parallels with Cabernet,
right? Which
everybody loves Cabernet. With Grenache, depending on stylistically where you're going, you can have some parallels with Pinot, you can have some parallels with Zinfandel, you can have some parallels even with, Jet Merlot, things like that, you can end up in those camps. And that's where, when you get into those GSMs, it really requires listening, and then the willingness to go there, and hopes that the people enjoy it. I wouldn't go straight to like a Beau Castel right away where it's all funky and more vet driven. Start them with something a little more entry level.
Let's take a step back here, because one thing I think you and I and most people who will give Rhone varietals a chance generally agree on is that they were delicious, that I'm glad that you sold me this bottle or opened it for me, that, wow, I found this to go really great with the food. But have these varietals, because they are not as ubiquitous in this grocery store shelves or even fine wine shelves or even fine wine lists, are they scaring people away? And I want to frame it from your point you made about red blends. If you put on the front Goliath or whatever fun name people want to make a red blend, and you put on the back Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, are they more or less likely to drink it than if it said a more well-known varietal like a Cab, Zin, Merlot blend?
I think the Goliath, and depending on the weight and intensity of the bottle and the glass, would play into that in terms of the psychology of that. But turning it around and seeing those varietals on the back, you're playing the game of, do they know what a Rhone blend is? Or are they just going to say, oh, Syrah, I've seen that before. Grenache, maybe I've heard of that. Mourvedre, I don't know how to say that, but I think I've seen that before. So it would probably, in a retail setting, I always divert back to, I'm from Utah, and if I pictured one of my friends or even my mother going to the liquor store and looking to buy wine, that's kind of where I put myself in that mentality of the average everyday consumer. And so I think they would gear towards, oh, Cabernet or Zinfandel, I've heard of that, and it's called, it's probably a fuller bodied, I probably would like that. People tend to, when they're by themselves, and I mean, even I've experienced this to an extent in my pursuit of wine going through, when you get into a wine shop and things are daunting and you don't know about that, you do a little bit default to whatever provides you comfort or what little you know. And as a sommelier and as a person with kind of that mentality, I was willing to be like, all right, well, let's take a risk. Whereas somebody else, especially in now time, if you are, you're budget conscious, which I imagine most of the world is at this point, it's hard to reach right for that wine you don't know, when left is something that presents a little bit of comfort and you don't have to worry about it.
You think that if somebody put on a label, remember, it's not required that you put a blend, it's just up to the winery if they want to put 68% Syrah, 22% Grenache, blah, blah, blah. If you wanted to just put 2% Cabernet in there, not list them at all by percentage or even weight of percentage, right? And you just put Cabernet, Syrah, Mourvedre, Grenache blend, would that engender more people to reach for that bottle? Or, and this is, I'm thinking about this along the way, are we just giving them a crutch by which to step into this world, even though it might have been a 75% Syrah, based blend, but by the virtue of putting Cab on there, they're like, well, I'm more comfortable with that.
Yeah, by giving them that little piece of comfort, whether it's deceptive or not. I mean, you see that a little bit, like you were saying about Aussie wines. I've seen something labeled Cabernet Shiraz, and it's 80% Shiraz and 20% Cabernet, but that's just how they put it on the label. And whether they're trying to actively deceive or they don't care because Cabernet and Shiraz are traditionally blended, it doesn't matter. But I wonder, the red blend thing, I feel like if you're looking at it from a pure business standpoint, is safe in thinking in a retail atmosphere, generic person buying a wine independent of any outside influences, whether they're engaging with the retail person or going on Vivino or whatever, or I should say a wine app. I think the red blend would get more people to buy it if you were to do a study of, say, 10 people. I don't know, Rhone blend, if that would actually do it. But my hope is that as we progress as a wine culture, I feel like there's more, granted, I'm in the small section of the wine community that is master sommeliers, people who are interested in wine and whatnot. I feel like there's getting to be a little more acceptance of the style of Syrah that comes like the broader spectrum. I feel like you're seeing a little more of people knowing what Grenache is.
Right.
More Vedra is still a little hit and miss, which is sad because it's really good. My World, because it's skewed based on what we import, Cinso pops up a lot, but that's just based on the things that I interact with, based on who we import, whether it's Chilean or Lebanese or South African. Cinso pops up, but I don't think it's easy, or it will. I don't think it will be easy anytime soon. And so,
now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to deceive anyone, nor do I advise that any of the sommeliers on the floor or retail people or any trade who are selling Rhone varietals would or should, nor would I advise that. Well, maybe I would advise a winery if they're trying to make a red wine blend that's going to sell to do like Cabernet and a bunch of Rhone varietals. But, you know, the conversation and what, you know, this is all leading to is talking to our trade, you know, colleagues who are both sommeliers and selling this wine on how to get behind the benefits of really pushing the Rhone aspect itself, right? I don't want to hide it underneath the guise of like more Cabernet, the better, or the fact that it has Zinfandel in it, the better. I simply want to push someone out of the nest and not deceive them into drinking a bottle of Syrah, because trust me, I did that plenty of times. And I came back and said, hey guys, what'd you think of the decanter? And they go, oh, you know what? This is great. What is it? And I waited for sure till they had, you know, a glass and a half out of the decanter. And I'm like, hey, this is Syrah from Coroti, or this is Syrah from California. And they go, wow, I don't really drink very much Syrah, but I don't think that approach gets them to go back the second time when they're with a new friend who is a Cabernet drinker and go, hey, I know we should drink Cab tonight because you like Cab, but guess what? The first bottle we're having is Syrah. Or I know you're a Chardonnay drinker, but the first bottle we're having tonight is a Viognier that has a small amount of new oak to it. Like, that is where we really need to get to. And so any thoughts on that, where, you know, I can sell a bottle of Syrah and you can sell a bottle of Syrah, but it's how to get, you know, that pull aspect instead of the push.
Correct. Well, and back to your original point, like when you said, if you were consulting to a winery, what I would be interested in hearing feedback on is not deceiving with the varietals on there. Do you just put red blend and don't even list varietals?
Right.
And if they want to pursue it, they can go look it up. But it's just, at that point, it's a red blend. It's like Chateauneuf de Pape. What is Chateauneuf de Pape? Well, it's a blend, but you have to go look for a specific producer, right. You know, and right. Does that garner success, and would somebody respond differently to that if that was an actual Rhone blend?
Well, you know what? People like Chateauneuf de Pape because it's fun to say.
Yes. Have you been on YouTube and had the mispronunciations of Chateauneuf de Pape?
No.
So anybody who's watching this, including Will, you need to go to YouTube after this and Google Chateauneuf de Pape pronunciations. And I'll just say you're welcome, because you'll hear that resonating in your head for till the end of time. But no, I think the point you got to at the end, I started with the first part because the second part I think is a much harder and much more long-term question. We're such a grape-driven wine culture here in the States. We do have that wave of the red blend, but how do subcategories like a red Rhone blend succeed when it isn't on the tip of everyone's tongue? And I think it takes things like major publications like Spectator, Enthusiast, major, you know, people that are out there influencing the market to discuss these things, to get it out in front of people so they see the word and have seen it repeatedly to where they're a little more comfortable with it, where it's that Rhone blend, Rhone blend, Rhone blend over and over, kind of like subliminal messaging. And that's not something that's gonna, I think.
When 2 years ago in November, when the Wine Spectator put out their top, 100 list or whatever, and put Merlot back at the top of the list, that was exactly doing that. It was taking Merlot out of the sideways camp where, I'm not drinking any effing Merlot, and said, hey, Merlot is cool again? Because that's what I thought.
I definitely, I mean, who knows? They maintain their integrity and how they put that together, but I do think there's an element of what is important in the market. That's why you saw Saxum at one point become #1 wine of the year. That's why you had Chloe Palta at one point.
Yes.
These are wines that bar none, like pound for pound, is it the Mike Tyson of the wine world? If you look at the parameters for whatever they've set forth for that year, it is. But on a independent of that, for what they were looking for that time, it may not have, eclipsed, 2015 Chateau Latour. But
2 years, no, maybe it was 3 years ago, a port was the #1. Mm-hmm. And I think, man, if a publication is a publication is a publication, they all have their own themes. Wine and Spirits magazine tends towards like more acid driven wines, and they tend to be a little bit more kind of somm nerdy kind of thing. Wine Spectator tends to be a little bit more fruit driven, but I bet if we went back and we looked at the #1 wines across like 25 years, I bet you there would be some sort of theme of like, well, we've done a Cabernet, we can't do a Cabernet again, so let's do something else. Now we did a port, okay, what have we not done? Well, we didn't do a Merlot. Hey, maybe next year it's going to be a white wine, because when was the last time a white wine was the #1 wine of the world, right? And maybe it follows consumer trends, or maybe it creates consumer trends, right? And to your point, having a Rhone wine be at someone's top, whether this is the Wall Street Journal or, whoever is writing New York Times, as like, this is the wine that I think you all should drink this year, would go very far for sure.
And I think at whatever point we return to whatever normalcy or whatever, that looks like, having things like pairing dinners and opportunities to get that verbiage and those wines out in front of people more so than not is a great opportunity. So it's on sommeliers and buyers and retailers to always pitch those and give them a chance. If you're not going to sell it if you don't give it a chance. It's kind of like you're never going to know the answer to that question unless you ask it.
Right.
And so half the battle is just having the willingness to be like, all right, you said you liked reds and you like medium to full bodied. Let's start here before we go straight to Cabernet, and give it that shot to sell a Rhone blend, because it also falls back on the person who's selling it to, one, listen and know what they're talking about in terms of what their guest needs. But then two, to understand the wines they have, because a Rhone blend from Paso is going to be different from a Rhone blend from Sonoma, which is going to be different from a Rhone blend from the Columbia Valley in Washington, which is going to be different from South Africa, which is going to be different from Grenache you see in Australia. So that understanding is required in terms of the conversation you have with the person. And so that's where I think, back to my original point, that conversation and really paying attention to what the person's saying and trying to put yourself in their shoes, not where your head goes naturally, but thinking about their shoes, their palate, their dollars that they're going to spend on that bottle. And then, how can you find them something comfortable that is Rhone? Because we all do, we love them, but there is that reticence to sell it. But it is, I mean, that's my day job is to sell a lot of Rhone varieties. And we just picked up, sorry.
No, this is one thing that I would say to the sommeliers who are watching this, or even wine shop, retail, or whoever. This is one thing that in the time where high dollar, high, scoring, low allocated wines, and some of them, like you were just mentioning, don't want to even sell into retail, where you can take advantage of your knowledge about the wine world, knowing that typically Syrah can set pretty high fruit load with full ripeness as well, that typically you get a very good value for a Syrah because the market isn't always there to support it. And you can use that to your advantage. If and when we go back to normalcy and you reopen your restaurant at 50% of the capacity and you know that every bottle counts, if you want to buy Rhone varietals and use those as your sort of stepping stone to offer value, you're going to be doing your guests a huge favor, because they're looking for the Cabernet experience on the Rhone varietal budget, as it would say.
Mm-hmm.
Most times we would say champagne budget on, or champagne taste on a beer budget, right? But
well, and to piggyback off that, I think you have a good point too, that a lot of times thinking in terms of sommeliers across the US and what they're going to gear towards, there's only so much Côte Rôtie that can go around. And there's only so much, you know, Rias and whatever heralded CDP. There's seems to be a wealth of Côte de Rhone and whatnot. But at the same time, look beyond, like what we're talking about, Rhone blends from other places. You know, research and read. That was one thing I loved and still love, is reading about regions that are up and coming for reasons. Like, I want to go find some Albarino from Uruguay right now because I've heard it's really damn good, and that sounds awesome. So Rhone blends from the likes of certainly Washington and just I mean, not to toot my own horn, but South Africa and wherever else you can see. Obviously different parts of California, the Santa Maria Valley, your neck of the woods, certainly Paso Robles, that can bring that, you know, flavor and style that you see in the Rhone, because there's a lot of good Rhone producers out there right now, Rhone style producers, I should be specific, that can give you the Rhone experience for, you know, like you said, champagne experience at a Prosecco price tag. And so you go get a bottle of said producer of Columbia Valley Syrah or a Grenache from Australia from the Barossa or even Grenache from South Africa. There's really good wines made in a very Rhone restrained style at prices that are very reasonable. And so encouraging that that exploration, I think, is a big part of it. The sommeliers that are engaged in this, and that is tough because there's a huge pie that you have to cover as a sommelier. But I would definitely encourage that, because Rhone wines, for me, have provided a lot of reward when I've explored the world of Rhone wines, whereas like Riesling to a lesser extent hasn't provided that same kind of satisfaction. I tend to go back to the safe havens of where I know for Riesling.
Let's play a quick game then here, and I'd like to know a producer that you can recommend for this. If somebody likes drinking Chardonnay, oaked California Chardonnay, what Rhone wine should they drink?
You could do, obviously, I mean, the easy ones are to say a Viognier, but I'm very critical of Viognier. I think there's a lot of Viognier out there that is reasonable, but somewhat underdelivers. So are you wanting actual producers or more region?
Producer. Is there a specific wine you could find for their wine list and put on there, or buy at a, you know, even online?
I mean, Gramercy Viognier, have you had that?
I have not.
From good old Greg. That wine is pretty phenomenal. In terms of, although he makes it in more of like an unoaked style. So if you're wanting like Guigal, La Dorian kind of oaked style.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Guigal, La Dorian, Condrieu is, I mean, one of the most fantastic white wines in the world, and it is a Rhone varietal for sure. And it will give anybody who was looking for like that Chardonnay experience exactly what they're looking for.
Yeah, and if you want more in our neck of the woods, you can do like an Alban wine as well. You could do like MArsanne, Roussanne blends that I've seen. Like our friends at Stoltman do a pretty awesome. I believe it's MArsanne that's the Avignon, correct? Do you know off the top of your head?
I do not.
Do you guys make a Rhone white?
Yes, we make a just this year actually. We made a Viognier at Bien Nacido, and it's 2019 vintage. We did 4 barrels, like 225-liter barrels. One of them was stainless. 2 of them were completely neutral. 1 of them was 1 year. And so the whole goal here was to obviously showcase the aromatics of it, but without like covering it in oak. You know, we want the oak to be there from that spice hint, but we didn't want it to be like an exact Chardonnay auxiliary.
Replica. You know? Yeah, and that's very easy to fall into with Viognier. I feel like to keep going with the Rhone theme, Grenache and Viognier in general, to me, have this very thin line, like tiptoeing on a razor blade. And when they fall off one way or another, they can either be too lean or they can be too fat. But when you find that tiptoeing on that razor blade, man, are they magical?
What about
Pinot? Pinot?
Yeah. What about Pinot for somebody who wants a Rhone varietal or Rhone wine?
Pinot in style, man. If you like Pinot Noir, then Aussie Grenache is a good bet. I mean, you and I have talked about that forever in terms of we have a pretty cool one, Cirillo, which is some of the oldest, if not the oldest, Grenache vines on the planet. and they are on sand, which, you know, sand and Grenache go well. Look at the price point that Chateau Rayas garners.
This is funny because the second time in, you know, a few weeks that we've mentioned Cirillo, but I also was talking to two Broadbent people, but, you know, I brought it up on the first call and then you brought it
with
up.
Max. Yeah.
If you guys haven't tried that wine, you need to. Even just the Cirillo, what is the like lower end cuvee?
The Vincent.
The Vincent. I mean, whoa, it's under Stelvin enclosure. When you pour it in a glass, it is pink, pale, see-through. It has enough texture and ripeness to make you agree that it's from somewhere like Australia, but man, it is so ethereal and fresh. I mean, absolutely Pinot worthy, like comparison.
Yeah, those are 75-year-old vines at a minimum, and some of the older stuff goes into it, and then the bottle step up from there is the 1850, which is their ancestor vines that are just crazy old. They look like trolls in the ground. The bushes, they're so well maintained. It's pretty beautiful.
What if you want something fairly oaky and, you know, full-bodied and powerful, like a Cabernet or Merlot or Meritage blend, like they'd get from Napa, and want to drink a Rhone blend or wine?
A Rhone blend that's oaky and rich. Let's see. You could
anything that's terribly allocated that nobody can get.
Well, I'm trying to steer clear of the French falling too easy into the Rhone, so I'm trying to go elsewhere. And I mean, some of the stuff you see from the Rocks AVA in actually Oregon, but technically it's all right on there on the border with. Oops, did I get kicked out?
I don't think so. You look like you're still here.
Here, hold on one sec. Back to meeting. There we go. Sorry about that. Something happened on my computer and I hadn't seen that before. I'm somewhat savvy with Zoom, but it like full on flipped me over. I apologize. But yeah, so some of the things you see, I mean, the easy ones are the iconic ones like Cayuse and whatnot.
Right.
And I like when some people take that Rocks fruit and blend it with another to give it a little bit of restraint. But for somebody who loves Napa Cab and wants high octane and wants, you know, some dark fruit, that rock stuff seems to do the trick in terms of Syrah. You could also very easily do some of the people too quickly group Aussie Shiraz into that camp that you talked about originally, which is let's do fruit forward, let's do simple. And there's a lot of stylistic variants coming out of Australia now that it's worth exploring some of the regions, whether it's, you know, in the Hunter Valley over by Sydney, and you get more of those secondary kind of meaty tones, or in the Barossa where it's traditional and it's some of the eucalyptusy minty tones with a little bit of wood character, but just that incredible intensity of fruit. It's not
this thing and put it side by side with Martha's Vineyard in California, right? Heights Cellars, where that eucalyptus thing is like a blind tasting theme for sure.
Yeah, it's impressive that the eucalyptus affects it in that manner and can manifest in that way. It took me a long time to figure out that marker. I was missing it as something else in kind of like a different way, but the eucalyptus tone in those is pretty unique once you nail it down. And then I don't know, I'm trying to think. I mean, France is easy in terms of that style of thing. You find a CDP producer that likes to put a little oak on their wine and a little high octane, whether it's open new oak or if it's just such an extracted example, like, you know, the Pegau stuff where they do like Cuvée de Capo, that are the small subsets of what they produce, and they're just so intense that would very easily satisfy somebody who likes the palate pleasure, the textural component of a Napa wine, which I think is important. That's one thing we didn't even touch on is texture. I think it's something that's more and more prevalent in what we're talking about with wines nowadays. The verbiage isn't exact, but people have different reactions and different feelings for certain textures. And I think it was another MS who was talking about some wine drinkers are texture drinkers and some are aromatics, and there's like a spectrum and you fall somewhere in the middle. But I think texture is something that's going to see more and more focus, I think, going forward.
I always tell people in that texture conversation is, you know, talking about a steak, right? I personally like a ribeye. It is the fat rendering out as it cooks. You know, to me, I like a medium steak because it's just started to get the fat to gelatinize and fall out, and every bite is fantastic. To me, I think of Cabernet, especially somewhere from Napa, for example, especially with 100% new oak, to be more akin to butter in that texture commentary, right? We've done microoxygenation on the tannins to make it super soft. You've managed everything with this, most porous new oak that you can get, and you've made that wine beautiful for something that you can pop and pour and it tastes silky. Well, to me, I don't generally put more butter on top of my ribeye. You know why? Because it's already fatty enough. Whereas something like a filet wants a little bit of fat. A filet wants that texture of that Napa Cab. To me, drinking ribeye is all about Rhone Varietals, because Rhone Varietals, because of the herb and the savory character, and to talk about texture, to me, they're kind of like a spike up, and then they soften off, almost like like when you're at the county fair and they have that like hayride, not the hayride, but like you get in the stack, right, and you go down. That's kind of how it is to me. It goes up pretty sharp. It's fairly tannic, and then it kind of softens out as it sits in your mouth. And to me, I want that, because I want that sharpness to cut through the fattiness on my mouth and then kind of linger and like do all its things. It's going to be fruity. It's going to be herbal. It's going to be, in some cases oaky, and have all of those balances.
Well, and two, the texture part of it, I think, is so important, but I like where sometimes Rhone blends have that little bit of astringency at the back end, whether it's stems, whether it's natural grape tannin or whatever. But back to what you're talking about with Napa Cab, they try to just create that seamless silk all the way through regardless. And so I remember one time I had a really nice steak, and then they brought over the bone marrow to go with it, and it was just too much rich, silky texture. I was like, oh, I mean, it almost, and I don't know if it's just me personally, which is probably is, and that's where sometimes things get lost on people, is whatever's important to you and you like is important. So that steak, man, oh, I will never forget it. It took me several years to come back from that, to be able to have bone marrow again, because it was just so much umami, richness, and fat. And I think they served it with a Napa Cab, and it was just like overload. And all I wanted at that point was, some like Vino Verde, not even Nebbiolo, just like bubbles and bitterness to cut through all that, to like Nebbiolo and some Pellegrino, so that I could take turns back and forth and refresh my palate, because it was so much palate. For some people, that high quality of a cut of meat and then the bone marrow is just decadence, and it's so beautiful and such a textural experience that they love it. And that's to create another point, is a side thing of what's important to you. So that poor lady who couldn't answer that question about cranberries and strawberries that we talked about at the start, I bet if there was a little longer conversation and she wasn't on a stage of like being in a dining room and being and asked questions by the sommelier, she could have done a better job of defining what she liked.
Well, and I'll finish the conversation just from the perspective of sommeliers. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, that the few things that we have been covering over the last few weeks, whether it's high acid wines or whether it's Rhone varietals, whether it's how to price a wine list, just talking about heat in regions, or all of these things. I hope that you recognize that every single night is an opportunity to learn. That I could have very well made the mistake of asking someone who was the host of the meal, who took one of her customers or clients out to a restaurant, who just wanted to have the sommelier pick something for her and bring it over so that they could get on with their conversation. I very well could have put her in an uncomfortable position. And so, to your point that you made about Paul Greco, that is what you always want to try to get at. Being confident at the table, knowing your wine list, asking the few right questions that can get you to give them a seamless experience without too much communication. You just want to be able to say, hey, what do you want to drink tonight? Red or white? What do you typically like? What's your price point? I have the perfect thing for you. Let me run away and come back and get it for you. And that, to me, is the best advice I've tried to give someone. It comes with experience. It comes with knowledge. It comes with pursuing your passion. But I mean, those are noble pursuits towards giving somebody an exceptional experience.
Yep, and they feed off you being like, I've got the perfect thing for you. And don't forget, even when you come back to the table and are engaging, you're still selling the wine. You're still selling that experience and on stage at that point. So don't let that ever leave your mindset. because that's part of the thing for them, is the presentation of it and the pouring at the table and the sommelier talking about, oh man, I wish I could have a glass with you guys, you know, with this pairing. It's going to be so awesome because the way the Grenache just cuts through the fat in this, whatever, you know, the cassoulet, that type of thing. And so that's something that can be lost on it. When you get the guest to commit to the wine, you're not done. That's only half the battle.
Right.
And so that was always something for me, just to show excitement and enthusiasm throughout.
Well, good, Josh. I appreciate you. I hope your haircut comes as soon as mine comes.
Yes.
These cuts are not.
Eventually, my hair, I think, will start predicting the weather or something like that. Maybe when I go full Ace Ventura and find my flowery shirt, I can I channel my inner 1990s Jim Carrey. Exactly.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all for watching. If you're interested and want to watch on Thursday, I'll be interviewing Augusto Ferrarese. He's the beverage director for Urban Kitchen Group in San Diego. They have 5 different locations, and we're going to talk about how to price a bottle to sell on your wine list, because it's not always about running a 35% margin. Sometimes it's about selling 700 bottles in a month. So stay tuned Thursday at 2 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.